County of Prince Edward Public Library. And my name is Liz, and I'm very excited to introduce our guest, Ian Hamilton. Ian is the author of 14 novels in the Ava Lee series and 3 in the Lost Decades of Uncle Chow Tung series, including his latest, Fortune. His books have been shortlisted for numerous prizes, including the Arthur Ellis Award, the Barry Award, and the Lambda Literary Prize, and are national bestsellers. BBC Culture named him one of 10 mystery and crime writers from the last 30 years who should be on your bookshelf. And the Ava Lee series is being adapted for television. So, with that exciting introduction, Ian, welcome. Thank you so much for
Thank
joining
you.
us today.
Thank you. You can hear me all right, I presume, yes?
I can
Good.
hear you. Yes, thank you.
Greetings from my dining room in Burlington. Oh, my house phone just rang, of course.
There's nothing like a Zoom call to make your phone ring.
It'll cut out quickly. Thank you to everyone for coming. I've done a few of these things in the last few weeks, and I'm not entirely comfortable with all the technology and stuff, but I muddle through. It kind of, and you never know how many people are going to show up, which is always a challenge. It reminds me of when my first book came out in 2011, and I was doing a tour with 3 young female writers in BC. We went up and down the coast, and we called the tour 3 Hip Chicks and 1 Old Fart, and it was entirely appropriate. And it was going pretty well. Then we ended up in the town of Squamish, a gorgeous place, and this very nice library, big library. And we go in, and the librarian was wonderful. She set up the room, and there must have been 200 seats there for us, and 3 people showed up for the event. And one of them actually came, and he brought his mother because he was looking after his mother. So his mother was there. She was one of the 3, and she properly fell asleep in the front row. So that was sort of my introduction to author tours. So after that, you sort of, whatever happens, and whatever goes on, goes on. Talk a little bit about my work. As Liz said, The Diamond Queen of Singapore, this book, which came out in the summer, is the latest Ava Lee. The one after this, called The Sultan of Sarawak, is written and will be out next Christmas, this coming Christmas. And we've just negotiated and reached a deal with my publisher for 3 more books. So there will be actually a 4th uncle and a couple of more Avas at the least. And then this summer, I have a standalone novel being published in July. It's called Bonnie Jack. And I know House of Anansi has high hopes for it. I'm a bit nervous about it. It's one thing for so-called literary writers to move to write mysteries and thrillers. It doesn't usually happen in the reverse. And so I'm kind of nervous to see how my book is received. It's actually based on my father's early life was the genesis of Bonnie Jack. He was abandoned in a movie house in Scotland when he was 6 years old by his mother. She took him and his sister to the movie house and left with the sister, never came back. And he didn't tell anyone in our family for 50 years until he made an announcement at a family dinner. My mother didn't even know. She always thought he was an only child. So I based the book's based on that in a rough form, but it's really about the search for family and identity and all the tensions that happen within. Anyway, this is the most recent book, Fortune. It's the 3rd book in the Uncle series. And the series came about, interestingly, not at my instigation at all. But for those of you who have read all the Ava Lee books, you know there's a character named Uncle who's very prominent. And for those of you who haven't read the books, I apologize. I'm about to give you a piece of plot you may not want to know, but Uncle dies at the end of the sixth book. And I have to tell you, a lot of people were unhappy with that. My motivation was of the purest kind. As I write, I don't plan or do big pre-plotting of my books. I basically tend to sit and write, and I let the story and the characters take me wherever they want to go. And I was writing this, I think it was the third Ava Lee book, and I realized that Uncle was going to die at the end of the sixth. Now, I've always worked with this long story arc in my mind, but that was longer than most. And I actually built, if you go back and read the books, I built the seeds of his illness in the third book. And then in the fourth book, it expands, fifth book even more. But even as I was writing the third book, I knew exactly how the sixth book was going to end. And it's sort of written the last two chapters in my head before I got there. But anyway, so Uncle died, and a lot of readers were upset. My wife was upset, and they kept saying to me, how could you do it? How could you do it? And I kept saying, well, it wasn't me. I had no choice. The story took over, and the story is what caused this to happen. But I'm at my publisher's one day, and my publisher and my editor grabbed me and said, can we talk to you? I said, sure. And they take me into their office and they say, we've been thinking, why don't you write a series about Uncle? About his early life. You know all the backstory. Why don't you do it? And I have to say, it took me about 30 seconds to realize it was a great idea. And it probably took me an hour to come up with 3 plot lines. And what I wanted to do, as I thought about it and then expanded on it, was write about Uncle's life in the midst of key times in the development of modern Chinese history. Okay, so the first book is starts in 1959, and that was the year. It was the heights of Mao Zedong's Great Leap Forward, when he was trying to radicalize the way the economy in China worked. And in the process, he totally screwed it up. I mean, completely. There was mass starvation. I mean, I've read estimates of as many as like 10 million people dying of starvation. So I used that as the trigger for Uncle leaving China to go to Hong Kong. And he leaves by swimming across Shenzhen Bay, which is a 4-kilometer swim, and the water is supposedly really, really treacherous. But as I was researching that part of 1959, a couple of things that were astounding. First, that over a course of 12 to 18 months, they estimate 1 million people tried to escape China, either by swimming or trying to get across huge barbed wire fences and barriers. And it's estimated more than half of them died trying. Okay, because the Chinese, the People's Liberation Army, just was not letting people cross the border. Okay, they were, for example, patrolling Shenzhen Bay and Mirs Bay, which is the other bay people would swim across, and they were shooting people in the water. Okay, and then in the morning, sending out crews to take the bodies out of the water and bring them on land. A very brutal time. So that was the setting for the first book, and that was. Second book was set in the middle 80s, and Deng Xiaoping was the premier, and he fascinated me as a character himself because he was the ultimate survivor. You know, I believe he was 4'11", tiny little man, and throughout his career with the communists, he was imprisoned twice. His son and wife were killed. I mean, he just went through everything. By the time he became premier, he was in the 70s. And And he was the one who set up the special economic zones. And what he wanted to do was to open China up to trade while protecting Chinese culture and their political way of doing things. And he used the special economic zones to do it. And Xinjiang became part of that. Now, when I wrote about Xinjiang in 1959, when Uncle was trying to escape from China, it was a collection of villages that had a total population of maybe 30,000. Today, Xinjiang has a population of about 18 million. It's sort of unfathomable to imagine that type of growth. Okay, but so it started when he set it up in the early 80s. That's where I plug Uncle into the second book, which is called Fortune, and it's about the growth of Xinjiang and Deng's vision for China. So this third book, Fortune, is set in the 90s, and it's set 2 years before the Brits were scheduled to hand over Hong Kong to the Chinese government. And there was a lot of paranoia in Hong Kong, rightly so, as it turns out now, right? About what was going to happen when the Chinese took control. And there was, so my hook is that the triads were equally paranoid. They had no idea what was going to happen. And historically, one of the very first things Mao did when he took power in China was eradicate the triads. He drove them right out of China. They left or they died. Those were the two choices. And he drove them out of China. So the idea of the communist government taking control of Hong Kong petrified the triads. And so my conceit as I was writing, my concept as I was writing this book was, what if the triads cut a deal with the Chinese government to protect their interests in Hong Kong, but to somehow do it in a way that bound them closer to the communists. And that was simply my concept. But as I started to research it, okay, I was actually shocked because I stumbled upon an actual agreement between the Chinese government and the triads that was struck pre-handover. And the Chinese government, the Minister of Public Security for the Chinese government actually said publicly the triads should be respected, and that if they contributed to the economic well-being of Hong Kong, they should be welcome as partners, okay? And so in my book, Uncle cuts a deal with the communists, and what they want him to do is pick up criminals who have left China or hiding in Hong Kong and ship them back across the border, et cetera, et cetera. And that kind of thing goes on all the time now, okay? And the reason the Chinese needed these triads was part of the handover agreement was that the Chinese government would not have a military presence in Hong Kong. That would be the Hong Kong Police Department who would be the presence. So the communists were using the triads as their troops on the ground, if you will. And I'm writing the book, and all the protests in Hong Kong started last year, the year before. And it's horrendous what was going on there. And then there were reports of armed gangs of civilians attacking protesters. And reading the Hong Kong newspapers, it was obvious they thought there were triads doing it at the behest of the Chinese government. And I really hesitated when I was writing the book about how far I wanted to take it and how far I wanted to justify Uncle's willingness to cut a deal with the Chinese government. Anyway, so I know that's a lot of backstory. I'd apologize if I was rambling. But anyway, so Fortune is set in that time period. And I'm going to have to get my glasses. Excuse me for a second. And a light. I'm going to read a little bit from the first chapter. I won't read the whole chapter, but I'll read a little bit of it. So chapter 1 is set in Macau, February 1995. Uncle Chow Tong sat in the lobby of the Grand Hyatt Hotel waiting for his friend Fong to arrive. It was 9 o'clock in the evening. Uncle had arrived an hour earlier by jet foil from Hong Kong to have dinner with Fong. He detested Macau and normally wouldn't have traveled there for any reason, but he was there at Fong's request, and given the nature of this invitation, Uncle couldn't say no to a man he loved like a brother. Fong, a lifelong bachelor, had met a woman he was thinking of marrying. He had asked Uncle to have dinner with the two of them so he could give him a candid assessment of her. Uncle wasn't sure what he would learn about Fanny Wang over a meal, but he had agreed to come. The dinner was scheduled for 10. The lateness of the hour necessitated by Fanny's job as a mama-san, managing a group of sex workers based at the Lisboa Hotel. The nature of her job wouldn't prejudice whatever opinion Uncle might reach about her. He viewed prostitution, properly conducted, as a victimless crime, and he had learned early in his life not to pass judgment on what people did to survive. Uncle sat contemplating his friend's situation when he heard what sounded like a fight erupting at the hotel entrance. He stood up and walked in that direction. Whatever was going on had frightened the doorman, who rather than intervening, was standing inside the lobby looking out through the revolving doors. Uncle went past him to the top of the steps that led into the hotel. Two groups of men faced each other. A group of 5 had a dominant position on the steps and were yelling insults and pointing fingers at a row of 4 men in front of them. Uncle could see guns tucked into waistbands for at least 2 of the 5. The men standing in the row were heavily tattooed and were waving knives in the direction of the quintet. Triads, Uncle thought. Hey, guys, what's going on here? This isn't the place to settle a dispute, he said. One of the men on the steps turned to face him. Oh, I know you. You're Yin's deputy Red Pole, Uncle said. And I know you, said Yin. You're a long way from Kowloon, said Uncle. We were sent here to help our brothers in Macau. They're members of Sun Yi On. These creeps have been poaching on their money lending operations in the casinos. Uncle knew a lot about Sun Yi On, including its more formal name, which was the New Righteousness and Peace Commercial and Industrial Guild. He'd been approached years before by one of their senior people and offered the chance to join the society and place his independent triad gang under its banner. At the time, Sun Yi On had more than 50,000 members worldwide, but there were dozens of factions and subgroups within the organization. Men like Yin and Kowloon ran their gangs as they saw fit. Uncle was promised he could maintain his independence, but he still said no. That may be true, but squabbling in public like this isn't going to benefit anyone, said Uncle. We take our orders from Yin, and he said to keep these thieves out of the Hyatt's casino. We'll do whatever is necessary to make sure they don't get in. The Hyatt fronted a main street, and Uncle saw that the dispute had attracted a crowd of curious onlookers, and that wasn't good. He walked down the steps, slipped between 2 of the Kowloon gangsters, and approached the row of men. My name is Uncle. I'm the mountain master in Fanling. I'm here to meet a friend, nothing more. I think you should leave now and speak to your mountain master. Tell him I suggest he call Yin and Kowloon to settle this. He already knows these are Yin's men, one of the Macau triads said. Then tell him again, Uncle said. Nothing positive is going to happen if you stay here. The men looked at each other and one said, we should regroup. This isn't going to work. The others nodded and then started walking away from the hotel. Uncle waited until they had gone down a side street and were out of sight before turning to face the men from Kowloon. Why don't you vacate these steps now? You are blocking the entrance. We'll move off to this. We'll move off to the sides, but we're not leaving, the deputy Redpole said. Whatever, Uncle said, becoming impatient with their thick-headedness. He stepped forward, the men parted, and he climbed the stairs to re-enter the hotel. There was still no sign of Fong as he sat down once more in the lobby. I'm going to skip a bit here, okay? And about half an hour later, there were noises from outside, and this time Uncle froze. No, they couldn't have, he thought, as he got to his feet and walked quickly to the entrance. He was sure he had heard a burst of gunshots and prayed that he hadn't. The doorman still hadn't ventured outside. He seemed rooted to a spot by the doorway. Uncle pushed past him and walked outside into chaos, overlaid with screams from some of Yin's triads and frightened onlookers. The three men who'd occupied the left side of the stairs were all bleeding, and one had tumbled onto the street and was lying flat on his face. One of the men on the right had also been hit. The deputy Redpole didn't appear to have been shot. He was kneeling next to the man on the street. Uncle went to him. Is he badly hurt? He asked. The deputy looked up, a mixture of rage and grief contorting his face. I think he's dead, he said. They came in a car, drove by slowly, and shot at us through the open windows. The cowards didn't have the balls to take us on, man to man. Uncle, a familiar voice called. Uncle looked up to see Fong coming towards him with a horrified expression on his face. These men are from Yin's gang. The shooters are local. The idiots decided to have it out in one of the most public places in Macau, Uncle said angrily. That's not the worst of it, Fong said, his voice shaky. What else has happened? Fong pointed to an area partly hidden by the steps, where a group of people had congregated. A woman and her daughter were shot, said Fong. It looks like the woman was hit in the arm, but the girl took a bullet to the chest. I don't think she's more than 10 years old. And that's the first chapter of Fortune. Liz, over to you.
Well, thank you very much for reading that. When I started reading the first Ava Lee book, I will never forget, I was rocking my baby in the night and I thought, oh, I'll just start reading this as an ebook. And she was fast asleep and I just kept reading and reading and I was completely exhausted the next day, but it was totally worth it. They're really books that keep you engaged and keep you moving through the pages. How do you write stories that are so tightly packed with action and various characters with different motivations? How do you plot that all out as you go?
I don't do much plotting. I mean, I don't know. I started to write, but I'm new at this. You know, I started in 2009, and when I sat down to write my first book, I had like one sentence in my head, and the name Ava Lee had come to me from absolutely nowhere, because I didn't make lists of names or anything. I just sat and started to write, and her character fortunately came to me like fully formed, so I knew who she was, and I quickly figured out who Uncle was, and I just wrote, and I started because I wanted to prove to myself I was capable of writing a book. I mean, that was my challenge, right? And I had no expectations of it ever being published. I just wanted to prove I could write one, finish one. And but as I was writing it, I was halfway through, and I realized I had a plot idea for a second book. Okay? And that's kept happening to me. It's never stopped. So when I was writing the second book, I had plots for 3 and 4 in my head, right? And I told you when I was writing 3, I knew how 6 was going to end. So I've always had this story arc, and I don't know where the inspiration comes from, but it's there. But when I'm writing, I'm very conscious of not boring my readers, okay? Which means I don't want to bore myself. It's the same thing to me, right? So I think of myself really as a storyteller, So I try to keep the story moving. I'm very conscious of pacing.
Mhm.
So I don't like to go off in long descriptive tangents that have nothing to do with the plot. Okay. Uh, I mean, all the places I write about in my books, I've been to. Okay. But again, very consciously try not to write travelogues. Okay. Uh, if I'm writing about a place, all I want to do is give you a taste of it. Okay. I take the one or two things that really stuck out in my mind that were distinctive about a place, and that's what I focus on. Okay. And I try to do that all the way through the books. And I do try to keep them moving. Okay. Because I'm constantly rewriting. Okay. I'll rewrite 10 times, a piece 10 times. And I start every day rewriting what I wrote the day before. That's an endless sort of process for me, right? But as I'm rewriting, if I'm reading something that, so what am I trying to do here, right? If I can't think of it, I take it out. I just get rid of it. I'm always cutting, okay? But I turn in manuscripts that could be 500 pages sometimes, and my editors do the cutting then for me. And I used to joke with my former editors that I always thought my role was to give her enough pages that by the time she finished cutting, there was a book left, So that was sort of where I was coming from. But no, I am concerned about pacing and not boring my readers. And I feel the same way about characters. If I'm writing about a character who starts to bore me, I get rid of the character. And if I'm writing about a character who in my head originally would just be a vignette, okay, and they capture me, I can make them all of a sudden they're a major character because they interest me, and that's sort of the way it works. For example, I'll give you an example of that. When I was writing The Goddess of Yantai, and Ava's lover Pang Fei, Ava has to meet her ex-husband Lao Lao, okay, and he's a totally wasted human being who had been a brilliant film director and is now he's a mess. The man's an absolute mess. And in my head, the plot line was simply Ava would meet with Lao Lao and get some information from him and move on. Okay. But as I'm writing it and she's sitting talking to Lao Lao, all of a sudden it occurs to me, oh my God, she's going to try to rehabilitate him. Okay. Okay. She'd always loved his films and she's talking to him. And I realized, oh my God, she's going to try to rehabilitate him. And so Lao Lao then becomes, in the next book, he reappears in the next book and he's a bigger character, okay? The book after that, which is The Sultan of Sarawak, which I finished, which is coming out at Christmas. I mean, Lao Lao is a major part of the book. And the book after that, which is The General of Tiananmen Square, which I've just started writing, I mean, he's, again, front and center. So from a little germ of a character in one book, all of a sudden he's a major character in all these other books simply because he interested me. Okay, so I sort of let them take me where they want to take me,
Interesting. Well, and it's interesting that you have a title for a book you've just started. I've spoken to other authors who say the title's the hardest part and they agonize over what to call their books, but it sounds like that's not a problem for you.
Oh my God. So when I when I did my first book deal with House of Anansi, they bought 4 books at one go. It was a 4-book contract. And I had basically written or was in the process of writing all 4 books. And there were no titles for any of the books. There were Ava Lee 1, Ava Lee 2, Ava Lee 3, Ava Lee 4, right? Which shows you how little imagination I had. So, and my first book was coming out in about 2 months. And I got a call from Anansi saying, we need titles. Okay. And I said, I thought that was your job. Like I thought my job was I write the books. Okay. Yep. I thought your job was to come up with titles. And they said, no. We need you to give us titles. So I harassed all my friends and family and no one could come up with anything. It was crazy. Okay. And but of the 4 books, I finally figured out I had a title for the second book. Okay. And I wanted to call it The Disciple of Las Vegas. That was the second book. So, and Nancy called me and said, "You come to a meeting. We need to get this resolved." So I go to a meeting at Nancy. And I said, "I think I have a title for the second book." I said, The Disciple of Las Vegas. And they said, "Well, the first book's coming out in a couple of months. Come on, we need." Then the vice publisher, Matt Williams, said to me, "We can use that as sort of a hook. We can use a geographic name and right?" So the third book, The Wild Beasts of Wuhan, came quite easily for us. And the fourth book, The Red Pole of Macau, came as easily. So now we have 3 books with titles. Still no title for the first book. So Matt reaches up in his bookcase and pulls out a book of Chinese zodiac. He starts to leaf through the book. Blah, blah, blah. He says, "Oh, look, water rat." He says, "I like that." I said, "Okay." I said, "Oh, and we can use Wan Chai, which is a Hong Kong neighborhood. Could we have some alliteration? So the water rat of Wan Chai." And we agreed that was going to be the title. But there were 2 problems with it. The first was there was no mention of a water rat in the book, and there was no mention of Wan Chai in the book. So I had to go back and plug in references, and I somehow managed to do it so it worked. So the book was published as The Water Rat of Wan Chai in Canada, but not in many other countries. They hated the title.
Really?
So when Little Brown in the UK had English language rights in the whole world except for Canada and the US. And they told Nancy, "We will not publish this book as The Water Rat of Wan Chai. We will not publish a book with the word rat in the title. It just turns off readers," right? So my book was published as The Deadly Touch of the Tigress in the UK and elsewhere. And then other international editions did the same thing. Okay. So in France, the book was published as The Escapee from Wan Chai. And my favorite title for The Water Rat of Wan Chai is a Turkish title, which translates into Rock, Paper, Scissors. And what that has to do with my character or the books, I have no idea. But as an author, you have zero control over titles. And titles, they are important. I mean, I'm sure you know the story about Stieg Larsson and the girl with the dragon tattoo. That was not the original title of the book. The original title was The Man Who Hated Women. Okay. And a very clever New York editor came up with the dragon tattoo title. So that, anyway, but once we got that format of The Disciple of this or whatever, the other titles came after that. It was relatively easy because I was writing with geographic places, right? So that was an easy part of it. And then it was a matter of just finding the front end hook. So yeah. So I've become a lot better at titles.
They're very memorable titles. Like immediately, oh, this is part of that same series. Even if you haven't read everything, you can look at it.
And with these, I came up with the titles: Fate, Foresight, Fortune, and I like that. Again, a little family. And the fourth book, which I've agreed to write, will be called Finality.
Does that indicate that's the final in that offshoot of the series, do you think?
I think so, although I'll tell you this. Yeah, I think so. But and I see it as being a 2-parter in my mind. In the first part, I wrote an Ava Lee prequel called The Dragon Head of Hong Kong, which shows how Ava met Uncle for the first time. And so I'd like to write about how Ava met Uncle from the first time through his eyes.
Well, that would be interesting.
Okay. And the second part of the book will be about him dying. Okay. But I want to write about it in the sense of him trying to create a safety network for Ava after he's gone, and all of the things he does, how he involves Zhu, how he does this, how he does that. And he's just trying to get things organized so that that she is well looked after he's gone. But then I had someone come up to me and say, between the prequel, The Dragon of Hong Kong, and The Water Rat of Wan Chai, which is the first Ava Lee novel, there's a 10-year period, which is blank. So that they are suggesting I go back and write more Ava Lee Uncle books pre-Water Rat.
Okay.
Because there's a 10-year period that I can fill gaps in. So that might take me till I'm 95, who knows, right?
I think people will be very happy to hear that, because I know we have some real fans that are library patrons there. There's always a holds list when you've got a new book coming out. I just want to remind everybody who's here, they can ask questions in the chat. I've got lots to ask, but if you're curious about something, please put them in the chat, and I will happily read them. So another question that I wanted to ask is, your characters obviously do a lot of international travel. Fortune taking place in the past, you didn't have to deal with COVID, but do you expect that COVID will exist in your Ava Lee universe?
I hope not. I'm so tired. I'm so tired of COVID, and
No.
mind you, as doing what I do, which is basically sit in the basement and write. Right. I mean, it's like I've been training for quarantine. You know, so
Yep.
it's not for me. It's not a huge disruption. But my wife is working at home full time now, which is a massive change in our lives, and but somehow we've managed to make it work. So. But you know what? The thing that I hate about this COVID thing is I miss my children and grandchildren something awful. You know, we have 8 grandchildren, and we really miss not seeing them. That's what's wrenching, you know. But for the rest of it, you know, I walk every day. I'm still working, but I don't want to bring COVID into the books. I try not to. Yeah, I have to be careful not to make them so current that 5 years from now they're out of date. You know what I mean? So closest I've come to that might have been the Imam of Tawi Tawi, where there are, you know, subtle suggestions about Trump-isms and things like that, you know. But yeah, I try not to be so current. And one reason I think I might be happy about going back and writing with old Uncle Ava adventures is I won't have to worry about technology so much.
Yeah.
Okay. I mean, that sort of wears me out these days, you know. She's always going to be texting or the this or the that, and I don't like any of it. So.
I know I talked to an author last year who said, now that we're in this COVID quarantine thing, I don't even know how to write a party scene or a busy bus station. Like it's changed my whole way of thinking of everything.
Yeah.
And I wondered how that might impact your books, but it sounds like maybe it won't, and you just will leave it out altogether.
I will ignore it. Yeah. Yeah.
Interesting.
Someone just posted a question I saw about how do I know so much about triads?
Okay.
Part of it is research, and part of it I spent more than 20 years working in Asia, in and out of Asia, and all over Asia: China, Philippines, Indonesia, Vietnam, Hong Kong, and and wherever I was working, I was reading about. I was making a really conscious effort to understand the history and the culture of the country I was doing business in. So I would read everything that I could get my hands on about a place. And you quickly learn, if you're the least bit observant, that in the Philippines, for example, and in Indonesia, and most Asian countries, except for Japan, the economies are controlled by ethnic Chinese. Okay. but ethnic Chinese who tend to take local names, so they avoid xenophobia, right? So I think it's The Disciple of Las Vegas. Um, the richest man in the Philippines, his name is Tommy Ordonez, but he's what they call a Chinoy. So he's an ethnic Chinese using a Filipino name. Okay. So then you get all these triad connections everywhere you go. Like you see the triads are everywhere. Okay. Like most of these countries are quite corrupt. Okay. And in the books, Uncle talks about, he likes it when he doesn't mind corruption as long as it's well organized, right? It's the ad hoc stuff he doesn't like. But and then I would bump into people in Hong Kong in particular. I met some triads, and through friends or whatever. And then I had a friend in Toronto who was shipping meat products into China, and the importer wouldn't pay him, and he wanted to collect his money, and he didn't know what to do. So I made a few phone calls, and we ended up hooking my friend up with a debt collection outfit in Hong Kong, who were triads. And I was on a conference call with him, and I remember him saying to the guy, okay, like, how will you go about getting my money? Okay. And he said, well, the first thing we'll do is we'll go to this guy's office and we'll yell and scream and swear at him and try to embarrass him in front of his staff. If that doesn't work, we'll go to his apartment building and we'll spray paint his name on the walls and the doors of the elevators. And there's a deadbeat and it was apartment number, and try to humiliate him and embarrass him there. And if that doesn't work, we'll take our machetes and we'll go to his office and we'll cut off his fingers until he pays. And my friend said, oh, that sounds good. So, and sure enough, he got paid. And so that's how I knew a little bit about triads.
So Sharon's asking, did it take long to get a publisher for your first book, and have you stuck with them?
I've stuck with them, and I was exceptionally lucky. Okay, and I think luck is a big part of all of this. When I finished my first book, the untitled Ava Lee one, I gave the manuscript to my wife to read, which I was told is something you should never do because your spouse will not be objective. People don't know my spouse. She's a great reader and she's horribly honest. And if she thought the book was crap, she would have said the book is absolute crap. And if she had, I trust her judgment so much, I would have put it away. Okay. Instead, she said to me, it's not bad, which for her was like a rave. So she said, maybe you should think of getting it published. So I made phone calls and immediately found out there's not a publisher in Canada who wants to talk to a writer. Okay. They won't answer your emails. They won't take your phone calls. They don't want you to send them manuscripts. They don't want you to send them anything. They want you to leave them alone and find an agent, because they want to deal with the agent. They want the agent to do all of the grunt work. And then I found out that finding an agent is almost as difficult as finding a publisher. But my daughter knew some people, gave me some names, and I cold called. And the first two people wouldn't even take my call. The third one, though, I think by mistake, answered her phone. And I told her that I knew someone who knew someone. And she said, well, what's your book about? And I said, it's about a Chinese-Canadian lesbian accountant who collects bad debts for a living. And she said, well, at least that's different. She said, send us the manuscript. And for those of you out there who are trying to become published authors, please, be optimistic, because I knew nothing. I knew nothing, okay, about anything, about the process. And the manuscript I sent to this agent was single-spaced with no page numbers. Okay. She emails me back and says, could you paginate it, please? And I said, I would love to if I knew what that meant. Okay. So I ended up sending it back to her. And a few weeks later, I get a phone call from the agent saying, we'd really like to meet with you. So I go in, and I thought it was one of those meetings where they say, it's a good start, but go back and do this and do that. Instead, they said, would you please sign this contract for us? So I signed the contract. Now I have an agent. About a month later, they called me and they said, we just got an offer for 2 books from one of the major publishing houses in the country. And what do you think? And I said, great. They said, but House of Anansi wants to meet with us. And we think we owe them a meeting. So let's go and meet with them. At the time, House of Anansi was still a poetry and literary house. They'd never published anything of my genre. So off we go to see House of Anansi, and I met the senior editor there was a tiny little Korean Canadian woman named Jenny Yoon. And I saw her, and she looked at me, I looked at her, and all I could think of was, oh my God, that's like Ava Lee sitting, looking at me, right? I thought this might go well. So anyway, we ended up chatting. And at the end of the meeting, they said, well, we're going to make an offer for, they'd read 2 books. But by then, I didn't, after I finished my first book, I didn't stop writing, not even for a day. I just kept going. So I wrote like the first 4 books in 8 months. And my agent says to Nancy, actually, it's not, you've read 2 books, but he's actually written 3. And I said, actually, I finished a 4th book this morning. And the next day, Nancy made us an offer for all 4 books. And we've stayed with them. And truthfully, I've stayed with them because of my editors. I've only had 2 editors, Jenny Yoon, who did the first 11 books, and Doug Richmond, who's done the rest since then. And I'm so comfortable with them and enjoy working with them so much. And I trust their judgment completely that it would be very difficult for me to break away from them. Hope that answers the question.
And Devin has asked if your background is in the financial world.
I was in business, and you can't be in business unless you know something about finance. And I ran businesses, so I was involved with all of that. But my first career was as a journalist. And then I was with the federal government as a civil servant and a diplomat. And then I went into business. So I have quite a varied background. And I have traveled, I think I've been in 50 or 60 countries around the world, and a lot of time in Asia, as I said. And when I was asked about previously, when the books first came up, people would ask me, like, how did you come up with all these ideas for the character settings, blah, 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 blah. And I would say, well, I actually don't know. They just sort of came to me. And then I was doing an event up near Ottawa, and a woman came up to me and she said, I'm a psychiatrist. And you have to stop giving that answer to that question because it's inaccurate. He says, what you're doing is you're subconsciously channeling all of the work experience you've had. You're channeling all of the experiences you had traveling in different countries, okay? You obviously have a tremendous respect for women, and that comes through in the books, and you're channeling that. And I said, well, how do you explain the fact that Ava is gay? And she said, subconsciously, you don't want another man ever to have her or to sleep with her. So you've built this thing around her that you don't have to worry about. So anyway, so that's the answer I give now.
Interesting. So I guess as maybe a good final question, I think you've answered this, but I know they'll want you to say it again. Vicki and Bev both wanted to know when they can expect another in the Ava Lee series.
Christmas. And it's called The Sultan of Sarawak. And it takes Ava back to Borneo, but a different part of Borneo. And she's forced to deal with a family who control a province and have laid waste to 85% of the rainforest through illegal logging, have been destroying the environment and the habitat of indigenous people. And they make the mistake of bombing one of Ava's small businesses in the province. And Ava decides she's going to go after them and does. So it's called the Sultan of Sarawak. And the initial, anyone who's read the first draft has really liked it. So that's coming out then. But as I said, my next book coming out is Bonnie Jack, which is the novel coming out in July. And I would appreciate any and all support you can give that book. So, thank you.
I'm certain we'll order it because every time you've got a new book coming out, our patrons are asking. So, well, thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you, Liz.
It's fascinating. We really appreciate it.
Can I ask one question? I don't know if my friend Lynn Kennedy and her husband Steve managed to attend. Did they? Do you know? She owns the Easton Main restaurant.
Oh, I don't see their names.
I've been to the county several times, and I usually stay with them, and they're lovely. I love the county. So.
Oh well.
Eventually,
we would like to have you in person when times allow. That would be great.
I tend to come back this summer, assuming that the quarantine and all this nonsense is over. And if I do come back, I'll let you know. Maybe we can do something with Bonnie Jack.
That would be great.
Okay.
Very exciting. Excellent.
Great. Thanks, Liz.
Thank you again, and thanks for suffering through Zoom. I know it's not as much fun as a room full of people, but we still appreciate hearing from you.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.